Okay, thank you for coming back. I can see there's a few missing on this team first, so I'll come over here somewhere. Would one of the teams like to tell us, give us the feedback you would like to tell us? Okay. But first, where is the microphone? Yes.
Well, uh, we detect a few things that we believe that answer this question. What do you think are the concepts of good management? One of the things is having the right technical competence,
Okay.
the enough knowledge, the skills, and the concepts for doing know, excuse me, know how to do or to work to deal with this kind of task.
Okay.
Other one is very well defined goals.
Okay.
Good resource management. That's a few things.
Okay, thank you very much. So is there a second group over here that would like to give us some ideas?
In this team, we think that good management needs a framework to operation or work that can be structured by regulations or guidelines. Other one is the induction to the organization and work. We think is important for the participants. Another is establish good communication between the participants and that promote the feedback.
Yep.
And the staff motivation to generate commitment at work.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. Is there another group somewhere up there?
Okay, that's okay. First, I want to say that I have for many years not to speak in English, and so my English is not so good. But we were discussing about first. You have to know what to do first.
Yep.
You are doing something. You have to know what to do, when, where, and check if you are doing the things like they have to do. They have to do it to be done.
Yep.
And you need organization. You need a protocol, a list of main goals to achieve, and we think that this goes to the standards. You have to have a list of standards.
Okay.
And check that you are doing what you have to do, and checking with the standards. And if your procedure is okay with the standards. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Are there any other groups? We have one group here. They're back now. They can answer. Okay.
Okay. Well, we have the organization must know its objectives and goals and communicate them to everyone.
Okay.
And it also must know its context and evaluate if it's reaching its goals, making sure that it can provide the necessary resources so that the people can complete their individual tasks and obtain reliable results.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right. Are there any groups that haven't spoken yet? Any more? No. Okay, so I think we've hit some fairly basic things, like we would say someone has to have a vision for the organization. You know, what is the purpose of the organization? And then from that vision, you try and achieve or set certain objectives. The objectives are tasks to achieve that vision. And then, as some of the groups have said, you must communicate that vision, you must communicate those objectives, and then you must motivate people to achieve them. That's very nice, but I guess if I was to say what percentage of people would like to win the lottery and retire, I guess the answer is 100%. Yes? And then I was reading somewhere some very informal statistics that said something like 80% of people don't like their job. If they could change their job, they would change it. And you go, why is that? Is it that management is really only for the top managers? Or is it about everyone in the organization? So when I said before the break, good management is about massive amounts of pay and holidays, that's what motivates the average person. How well do I get paid and how much time do I get free to do what I want? But it also brings in other things. One of the key aspects I've heard about management is balancing the differences between risks and opportunities. You know, what degree of risks are you willing to take, and what new opportunities are you willing to look for to try and drive your market? Another is, how much risk are you willing to take with money? You know, you get people who are very cautious with money, and then you get gamblers who are very prolific with how they will spend money. So where is good management in those kind of decision-making issues? So good management really comes back a lot of the time to decision-making. But it also involves people. So you can make all the decisions you want, and they can be well-fed and accurate, but unless you can motivate the people to achieve what you want and somehow reward them to do that, they're not going to do what you want. So I think when we start talking about good management concepts, we're talking about fairness of dealing with people. We're talking about recruiting people. I mean, you talked about, I think, induction. Someone talked about induction. Well, in fact, it's more than just induction. It's how do you make sure you get people with the right characteristics into doing the right job? I think, Raphael, you talked about technical knowledge. That's part of it. It's, you know, are the people competent to do what they're doing? So when you talk about good management, it's about money, it's about risk, it's about opportunity, it's about people. But what about allowing people freedom to do things? You know, again, that's part of the risk. Someone says, I have an idea. Do you say, no, our system is this? Or do you say, go and try it? I mean, we've heard a lot in the past years in quality culture about the Japanese Revolution. I remember visiting a Japanese-owned company where they had followed all the requirements of all the different programs. Everyone wore the same boiler suit. You could only tell the top manager because he had a red label, not a white label. And everything was clean and tidy. It was a company making foam products. And foam is notoriously dirty. You find bits sticking to the ceiling. It's messy dirt, but this factory was spotless. So they had everything clean, everything tidy. They had fantastic processes. In my visit, I didn't see one person smile all day long. So you can put in your processes and procedures, but if you don't have a degree of humanity and flexibility, people will not be happy. And if you don't keep them happy, they're going to leave. But let's take your university here. If I was going to plan a project, and I think one of you said, you know, it's time, resources, checking. How do you deal with a proposal for, I want to do a piece of pure research, I have no idea how long it's going to take me? You know, if someone is going to find out new subparticles within a nuclear atom, it could take, I don't know, 30, 40 years. How do you actually manage that? These are questions some of you must be addressing within your work. It's not like a commercial product where you say, you know, I want a new car developed within 2 years, or I want a building constructed within 1 year, where you can apply very strict project management approaches. But how do you deal with open-ended commitments in fields like academia? How do you manage that? I don't have the answers to that. But again, you have probably to think about sub-goals in achieving that process. You have to say, you know, an annual review will be telling us if you're making progress. And you may also want to think, well, you know, there is a point in time where we don't see any results and we have to cancel. So what are the conditions you put in management for saying to people, this isn't working, we need to stop? Because a lot of companies find they can't say no. Once they've started a project, they just don't stop. So that's been a lot of useful issues about the concepts of management. I now wanted to do a second exercise, which is, if you're looking at those concepts, what tools do you need to try and achieve good management? Now, you mentioned a framework, but let's put you in groups again to discuss tools. Because how do you make your risk decisions? How do you make your opportunity investment decisions? What is it you need to do that? So can I put you in groups again for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, to discuss what tools might be needed? Okay? So please go ahead into groups again. Okay, have you had enough time? Yeah? Okay. So can someone give me some feedback on what they've been thinking? No, you started last time. Can we go to this group this time?
Well. We're
Okay,
back.
he's got the microphone.
Yeah,
He wins.
we need the micro. Well, in this case, our group established that the strategic plan is one of the tools that we need in order to achieve a good management. For one way is to know where we are going to go and how we are going to go. And this means also the business plan, and in order to obtain the resources that we need in order to achieve the goal.
Okay, that's good, but to me that sounds like you've just been focusing on what the very top managers deal with.
Well, a little bit.
You know, if you're in a hierarchical organization, and most organizations are hierarchical, someone 2 or 3 levels down never gets to see the strategic plan,
But no,
doesn't hear about the business plan.
yeah, but also we have to establish the metrics in order to achieve and follow the results.
Okay,
The
so
employee-
performance metrics, KPIs, see how you're meeting the strategic plan. Okay, useful. Which other group? The microphone's in this area, somewhere over here? At the back? Yep, thank you.
Hi. Our group recorded for the question that what tools do we need to support to achieve good management? We said a good direction and administration or management, a legal framework that includes all the norms and the directions and the theoretical framework. And this theoretical framework needs to be efficient and needs to have empathy, be a person with empathy and leadership. Then we added to that the market research. I don't know if that's the word that it's used, investigación de mercado. The needs that are required for those users that we will have. Then a capacity building and incentive programs that includes the evaluations, documentation, work team, and recognition, and then infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you have some very useful ideas there. So earlier you talked a little bit about context, and you've just talked about market research. So one of the questions I was going to ask is about awareness. How do people keep themselves aware of what is happening in the world? And how do you react to that? I actually use an example, some of you may have heard it when I've spoken before, about Nokia, the phone company. Do you know what Nokia started by making? Toilet paper. Well, Finland, it's a Finnish company, is full of trees. Actually, it was wood-based products, one of which happened to be toilet paper. It then moved to making car tires. And only eventually afterwards did it move to making telephones. So how do you create the kind of awareness and culture in an organization that says, what we're doing isn't profitable enough, we don't see enough in the future for this, we need to change? What kind of tools do you use for that? So, you know, is it just the chief executive should read the paper every day? Because some of you wonder why when you go in the chief executive's office, he's sat there reading the paper. He's actually doing something critical, creating awareness of himself. So awareness is one issue. You picked up about processes and procedures and things like that. I think that's about trying to manage and control what you've decided. Okay? Let's try a different group, see what you're saying.
Okay, so we have established a procedure for communication where you have, well, what is being communicated, how, who, and when it's being communicated. Managing any changes to the original procedures, managing the knowledge of what you're going to be making, analyzing the risks, and well, lots of managing of the economic resources and different types of resources, the people, the infrastructure, and the general ambience in the workplace. So having happy people mainly. Delimiting the tasks that everyone is going to be performing. I think that is very important. And having indicators of the general, development of the people. And having norms, procedures, legal requisites, and just general rules for the workplace.
Okay, very useful. I think a lot of what you've said, the systems and tools you've indicated, depend on data. So really it's about how do we gather data about what is happening, and then how do we analyze it, and how do we then take action on it, and then disseminate that data back into the organization. So that's very useful, and that's huge. I mean, how do you do communication? You said processes for communication. That's a principal tool of senior managers in particular to talk to the members going down their hierarchy. In the UK, we have a children's game. We call it Chinese Whispers. So you put a line of children, and one whispers something to the next, to the next, to the next. And then you compare what the one at the end hears compared to the one at the beginning. And the problem with organizations is that frequently the top managers, they have good visions. They're very clear. They communicate it. But because of the whispers between each level, when you ask someone at the bottom, what do you think your senior managers want? It's very, very different. So, communications is really difficult to achieve properly and to achieve it so that it succeeds in the way that the top managers want. I mean, you can write mathematical expressions about between two people, there's two means of communication, 1 to 2 and 2 to 1. Between 3 people, there's 6. I think the mathematics is 2 to the n minus 1 methods of communication where n is the number of people. So you suddenly start taking an organization of 1,000 people, how many communication paths do you have? In fact, one of the directors of General Electric Corporation was rumored to have said, $1 invested in improving the communications and management of my organization gives me a better return than $1 invested in new product development, especially when you have large organizations. So yes, data for supporting the systems and means of control. Excellent. One group I think you also touched on the first group reporting back, stakeholders. We haven't really talked too much about stakeholder management. We've talked about risk and opportunities, but what are the typical kinds of stakeholders we have? We have the customers, obviously. We have the people working for the organization. They're probably the most financially directly affected. But what about shareholders? What about the banks? You know, they've lent you money. They expect something in return. And sometimes, you know, when you hear about this company's gone bankrupt or this company's cut its dividend, you go, wow, that means that the senior managers are giving more attention to those external stakeholders, perhaps, than to the internal employees or to their customers. So stakeholder management and balancing the various demands of stakeholder groups is, again, a critical management activity. Okay, we had a couple more groups to speak to us coming back over here. You were going, thank you.
Well, the analysis of this team is motivation, capacitation, internal or external standards, resources, risk analysis, and sensibilization.
Okay. I think those are more effects than tools. I mean, you mentioned motivation. What is a tool to motivate people? Do you know about methods and techniques for motivation? Shotguns, they're not accepted anymore. Whips, that British Navy stopped using those a while ago. You know, we had good motivational tools in the past. So in today's environment, how do you motivate people? Are there tools you can go and read about that will help you do that? Okay? Thank you. Any other groups? No? Yes?
We have one more. The others are repeated.
Yeah.
We think in a process, a good process to call for specialized personnel, for selection of the specialized personnel.
Okay, I think that relates earlier. I was talking about recruitment processes, and actually, one of the techniques of good managers is that they are able to delegate work very well and to create teams. So it's how do you select people to be in a team, to lead a team, and to motivate that team. And I think that reflects what you're saying. The processes you use to do that are very important. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about systems. The systems approach. Why do our standards go for systems? In the old days, we had ISO 9001, the first 2 editions of which just had 20 items. It had things like, you must keep training records, you must use statistical methods, you must do reviews of contracts. And people looked at these 20 discrete requirements and they said, well, actually, what is the relationship between all of these activities you're asking us to perform? And then the ISO 14000 standard started talking about the Deming cycle, the plan, do, check, act, review cycle, which puts things in a sequence. And ISO 9000 started talking about a process approach, saying what you need to work out what all your processes are and how they interact and make sure they're properly managed. So we started with discrete activities, and then we found people said, show us what a system is. So a system approach identifies the interdependencies and interrelations between the various parts of the organization and helps to get a holistic view of what the organization's doing. Some of the advantages of it is it increases an organization's adaptability to its contextual issues and changes, so its reactivity to its business environment. You look at the organization as a whole, not as its parts. Decisions are made keeping in mind the macro, the big picture, as well as the micro side. It focuses on achieving the individual as well as overall objectives, and it leads to uniformity in decision making to avoid specific domains getting preferential treatment. It's adaptive and dynamic. It focuses on multiple dimensions of management, concentrates on end results rather than on the means. It provides an orderly and efficient plan of action. It develops coordination of the specialist activities. It provides a good basis for control, and it frees management from many daily details of operations management. And I'll come back to that last point. So, from management systems theory, by being systematic, you should be able to focus on unexpected issues rather than the repeating expected issues, because those should be fully under the control of the system. I put in brackets, unfortunately, people tend not to be as consistent as machines. That's because the topic we're going to be addressing is health and safety. Machines don't have health and safety so much. People do. And if you sort of do a process design, you can put a line of what you expect your process performance to be, and then you can have small variations about that, the green stars, because those are expected events. So, for example, you know, in your office, the photocopier runs out of ink. You know you have to change the ink cartridge from time to time. Or with a machine, you have to stop the machine to maintain it. Or even with very big machinery, you know, a power generator in a power station, huge piece of equipment, you may have to take it offline for a month to maintain it. So there are expected events, and the system should be coping with that. The system should be designed to cope with all those expected events. It's the unexpected events that you need to be managing more carefully. And really, by being systematic, you know, the system should take care of the day-to-day stuff. You as a manager should be focusing on the unusual and preventing the unusual. So I've given some examples of expected events. Maintenance, I just mentioned, but what about people? You go on holidays. In the summertime, I'm guessing most of you go on holiday. So what happens to the regular job? And you have seasonal variations. So for us, summertime is holiday time, but for the agricultural communities, it's harvesting time. They need people. Or for us at Christmas time, the post office, suddenly the volume of parcels and letters triples. They need to get extra people in. So how do you manage these expected variations? But they are expected variations. Those are not unexpected. And then what about pregnancies, retirements, other factors affecting people? You should be able to predict these, and the system should be helping you plan for them. You know, if you know someone is retiring in 6 months' time, do you start recruiting now? Or do you start recruiting 1 year before because someone has to be trained to replace them? These things should be built into your system, and as a manager, it should be giving you alerts when things need to be done. But examples of unexpected events, an equipment failure. You know, something breaks, that happens, we have to deal with it. But what about a transportation strike? Suddenly no one can get to work. How do you deal with that? Now, depending on your culture, and unfortunately in the UK, our culture is you will get at least 2 metro strikes every summer. It's a good time for holidays. So we have to plan those metro strikes into our equation. But what about other natural events? Earthquakes. Mexico City, you have small earthquakes and you have big earthquakes. You know, how disruptive are they into your work process? What about the injury of a critical worker? Car crashes, they happen. That's life, it's very sad. People falling off ladders while doing decorating at home, it happens. So how do you deal with an emergency situation where you've lost a critical member of staff? Is that you put in knowledge systems, knowledge sharing systems, so that if a critical member of staff goes, the information that you needed to make your decisions on still exists within the organization. Too many organizations we find allow people to become so specialist and so unique that if they go, the organization can't continue functioning. I'm actually dealing with a national standards body right now where their salesperson is due to retire in 6 months, and they have no one to back that person up. I'm going, do you realize you will cease to function because you won't be able to sell anything in 6 months' time? Maybe they'll listen to me, I don't know. But what about something like the bankruptcy of a supplier? I think you guys in laboratories, you use reference materials. What happens if one of the reference materials companies goes bankrupt? Who's going to supply that to you? Are there alternatives? How critical is your dependency on these kind of people? So there's lots of things you need to think about, both as repeated things that the system should be dealing with, and maybe you should be brainstorming from time to time how you cope with the unexpected and what kind of contingency you put in place when that happens. But now I'm going to tell you the long history of ISO management system standards. So in the beginning was ISO 9001. It was published in 1987. And the success of that standard was completely unexpected. Most people think, oh, ISO 9001, ISO is, huge on this. No, ISO 9004, which was a guidance standard about quality, was expected to be the big standard. Certification really didn't exist very much in those days. And it grew unbelievably fast. People wanted to be able to demonstrate that they had achieved success. But other disciplines, such as the environmental sector, soon started thinking about how they could copy this approach. And so we had the ISO 14001 standard produced in 1996. And there are now something like 26 certifiable management system standards and about 44 guidance management system standards. But I've said management system. ISO actually has a load of management standards, which are not system standards. And if I start showing you what topics they're covering, so records management, security in the supply chain, ship dismantling, food safety, IT services. When we were talking about managing, I didn't say what should we be managing, but just by looking at some of the titles of these, brand valuation. How do you value your brand? For instance, Coca-Cola, 85% of the value of Coca-Cola is the brand. Coca-Cola just manufactures a bit of concentrate. It then allows subcontract bottling companies to actually produce the drink. So Coca-Cola's actual value is the brand and brand perception in consumers. Sustainable event management. This was a standard used to run the Beijing Olympics. How do you make sure you run big events in a sustainable way? Business continuity, project management, outsourcing. There's a whole standard about outsourcing. It's quite a complex standard. It's about how does a very large organization, for example, I flew here on British Airways. British Airways has completely given its accounting function, both external and internal, to one of the big accounting companies to do it for it. What are the risks involved in doing that? Road traffic safety, asset management, obsolescence management, I can go on and on and on. There's a whole load of sector standards based on ISO 9001 for the automotive, oil, local government, healthcare, nuclear sectors. I'm sure more will be produced in the near future. These ones are recently published. Educational establishments, ISO 21001 is a standard for any kind of educational establishment, right from infant schools up to universities. How do you deal with improving education? Animal welfare management. Do you use animals for security, dogs or something like that? How do you make sure that they're properly looked after? Facilities management, how do you make sure buildings, hotels, etc. run properly? Under development at the moment, there's a standard about blockchain, a standard about whistleblowing, innovation management. I think they've actually published one on innovation. I think one of the 56 uses.
I was just wondering what that standard for whistleblowing is. Is this the one that, for instance, salesmen people whistle on board? Or?
No. Whistleblowing is the process whereby if you as an employee think that your company is not complying with regulations, particularly safety regulations, you can go and report this to either a very senior director or to some external agency, and you are protected in your job for doing that. The issue is that people in the past, when they've raised these issues, they have generally been sacked or dismissed from their work. And it's because they're working in a culture where management doesn't like being exposed as not complying with the law or performing safely. So whistleblowing is about reporting bad things and yet being protected in your work. I don't know what the equivalent expression in Spanish is. Okay? There are also some very new standards areas, transaction assurance and e-commerce. So I talked about one of the drivers for standardization being consumers. Consumers are saying, you know, when I go to the internet and do some shopping, which more and more of us are doing, how do I have assurance that I will get what I order? Should there be some kind of quality mark for the website? And what does that involve? You know, if you're a catalog shop like Amazon, how do you know that the supplier who's advertising on Amazon is actually a good supplier? So it might require Amazon to go and do other things. So it's not as simple as, can I trust the web page? It's, does the owner of the web page have to take actions to give that level of assurance? Sustainable finance, this is more about companies that make investments. Really, they should be making sure that those investments are for sustainable activities. Okay? But even although those activities I've just been through are within the ISO framework, we know that outside of ISO, there are also quite a few management systems activities that are continuing. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority, for example, had a load of quality standards. One of them has been migrated to ISO, but it still has others. So is it that the IAEA will consider it's more effective to stay outside of the international standards arena, or may they decide that actually it's more effective to have ISO develop them? The United Nations published a quality standard on demining after wars. How do you remove mines, landmines and other nasty things? So there are a few activities we know that are outside of ISO, and even within national standards bodies. For instance, BSI has a standard for design management, quite an extensive series of standards. Will we give these to ISO in the future? I don't know, but that's possible. And other national standards bodies similarly have other programs. Just to promote BSI a little bit, I have to say that BSI claims it initiated a lot of the management system standards. So there's 2 pages of slides that I'm not going to read through, but I have to promote BSI and where I work for occasionally. So looking at ISO 9001 and going back to this 1987 when we started, I mentioned it had discrete sets of requirements and it wasn't really a system. And then 14001 came along and it started talking about the Deming cycle and plan, do, check, act. And in fact, ISO 9001, the committee for that standard, had already discussed using a process approach. And so actually when the 1996 version of ISO 14001 was published, people said it didn't look like 9001. That caused a lot of problems. But I'll come back to that again. Oh, sorry, I've covered this slide already. When 14001 was published, people said, well, there are many similar topics to what is in ISO 9001, but these topics are in a different sequence, and although the requirements for some of these clauses are almost identical, there are certain subtle changes. Why is this? You know, no explanation had been given as to these differences, and users were saying, this seems illogical to us. You know, ISO 9001 had a clause on internal audit, and the internal audit clause required the auditor to assess the effectiveness of the management system. The 14001 clause deliberately did not include assessing the effectiveness of the system, but no explanation was given for this. So when we looked at what was in 9001, 2008, that was the sequence of the clauses. And if you compare that to the 14001, one of the big problems in trying to bring these 2 standards together was the argument about what model do we use and what clause sequence do we use. You can see internal audit and management review are right at the end, whereas in 9001, management review at 5.6 and internal audit was the last item. So people were saying, you know, why can't these be in the same sequence? So after long discussions, ISO decided it really needed a common framework for all of the management standards. And really, this framework should make sure that companies and users of the standards could easily integrate them into their own management system. Because what we'd found up to that point in time was that with ISO 9001, because its success was very rapid, and that companies found they couldn't bid for tenders unless they were certified, the value of getting the certificate was so high, they started creating systems within their companies just to make sure they got compliance with 9001, rather than using it as a tool for the way they manage their business. So people started having different management systems. And really what we wanted to make sure when creating this new approach in ISO was that you had recognition that a company has a system and that system uses the different standards. The standards and the processes for those standards should not be separated from the management system you use in your organization. And this framework should facilitate bringing together all the different standards so that if you wanted to use 14,000 with 9,000, or you wanted to use ISO 45000 with 9,000, you could do so. There was nothing to stop you doing that. So that led to the decision about the common framework. And this decision was decided in 2012. It was published in 2012. So all management standards should have the same primary clause sequence. There have to be some adjustments for sub-clauses. There are a set of standardized core terms and definitions that we have to use. It makes it, in theory, more efficient to address multiple management system requirements from different standards, and it integrates the facilitation of these different standards into your company's system. And when we look at the clauses, for those of you who are familiar with the ISO 9000 standard for quality, introduction, scope, normative references, I will explain that later, and terms and definitions, that's common across all types of standards. Really, where we start becoming different for management systems is at clause 4, where we start talking about context, leadership, planning, operations, performance evaluation, and improvement. So now if you look at most of the management system standards, they have already been converted to this sequence. Not all of them yet, but as the others come up for revision, they are being moved across to this sequence. But one thing I have to say about the clause sequence in standards is when you're implementing standards, the sequence of a standard is not the sequence in which you should be using the standard. So for example, you can be doing several activities in parallel. You can be doing a management review whilst an internal audit is being conducted. And we find a lot of people who are new to management systems world, they say to us, why is there no requirement for an initial review? Because you need to know where you are before you start implementing a system. We say, but we can't repeatedly assess that clause on initial review. And because there's a continuing assessment process with management systems, having an initial review as a requirement is not helpful. So the guidance documents that support these standards do talk about initial reviews, but not within the main standards themselves. There's no requirement for an initial review. So there's various approaches, and what we find is the Annex L framework incorporates numbers of them. So I mentioned that the ISO 14001 standard talked about the Deming cycle and plan, do, check, and act, and that ISO 9001 had been basing its approach on a process approach. How do you map all your processes? How do you make sure they're working efficiently? So we had to find a way of integrating all of these. And really it was introducing the concept of risk management as an overlaying principle across all the standards enabled us to say, well, you need to be looking at the risks of how you're operating. Are your processes working effectively? Are they resourced properly? So that's how we could manage to combine the two separate processes from the different standards. And that's where we find, when we look at an example of one of the management standards, and this is actually 45001, you can go clause 4, 5, 6, and 7 are really about planning within your system. Clause 8 is about doing things, clause 9 is about checking, and clause 10 is about improving. So that's really where we say you can fully see the Deming approach is embedded in this new framework that's been produced. But ISO's definition, what is a management system? This is the formal definition, a set of interrelated or interacting elements of an organization to establish policies and objectives and processes to achieve those objectives. So I think when we were discussing what are the kind of tools we need for supporting good management, we can see we were talking about, objectives and policies and processes. That's enough of what I want to say on management systems. Okay? Are there any questions? No? Okay. So now I'm going to move to talking about health and safety, and I have another exercise for you. Yes. Sure, please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Which is the difference between do and act?
Doing is you have planned a series of activities, okay? And doing is the performance of those activities. Reviewing then follows the doing to see, have you done those activities properly? And act is taking action to improve. It's not acting as in doing. Okay?
Thank you.
If I go back, classically, this was the Deming cycle given graphically in the ISO 14000 standard. And it starts with the box on the right saying environmental policy, planning, implementing an operation, checking, management review, and continual improvement. So you go from what are the policies, what is it you think you want to do at a very high level, then you set objectives, and from that you plan the activities you want to do. Then you have to do them, the implement and operate. Then you check they're done properly, and then you look for improvement opportunities. Okay? Okay?
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. So far today we've done nothing but management systems. So now I'm going to slightly start with health and safety. And what I want you to do is get in groups again and think about what is health and safety. Please tell me what you think health and safety is. Okay? And we're going to finish today. I'm not going to take the reports back on this today, but we have until about 3 o'clock when we close. So at 3 o'clock, well, sharp is up to you. If you get very intense on discussing what health and safety is, you can continue, I'm sure. But please start discussing what you think health and safety means. Okay? And I've put there, think about the historical context. If you have any familiarity about some of the legislation that was introduced in Mexico about health and safety, think about 200 years ago, how we used to work 200 years ago. What has changed in that time? Okay? So I'll give you a hint. Holidays. Did you used to get holidays 200 years ago? Right. Okay. I don't get them now. Right. Okay. No. Okay, I'm beginning to see people leaving. So it's nearly 3 o'clock when we were due to finish. So you're welcome to leave. We will start again tomorrow in your groups. I will give you 5 minutes to continue this topic tomorrow morning, and then we will receive your reports back on this topic. Okay? Thank you.